Thank you, Alicia, and welcome everyone. My name is Jordan, and this is Andrew, and we are two programmers who had the privilege to work on two titles that came out of Magic Leap last year, Dr. Broadbort's Invaders and Create. Each title showcases the possibilities for content generation on an emerging spatial computing platform, the Magic Leap One. Our tech and the wider mixed reality sector is founded on the idea of mixing the real with the virtual. Over the past few years, we've had a chance to acclimatize to virtual reality, a technology that requires an establishing of bounds through markers that signal real-world obstructions like walls to safely immerse the player in a completely virtual experience. We've also seen augmented reality, a technology that provides a layer of virtual content atop the natural world. And today we'll be discussing what it was like to develop for mixed reality, a technology that detects the environment which is communicated to the virtual content in such a way that facilitates interaction in both the virtual world and the natural world. The Magic Leap One is comprised of the Lightwear, Lightpack, and Control. The Lightwear is the pair of glasses that you wear. These allow you to see the virtual content as well as your surroundings. The Lightpack is a portable powerhouse that runs the experience. Though powerful, it needed to stay wearable, which meant that we had to consider computer processing as well as standard thermal regulation. I'm sure developers who've worked with high-end mobile games can sympathize. Finally, our Control provides an input mechanism as a way to engage with and control virtual content with 6 degrees of freedom, which essentially means it'll detect pitch, yaw, and roll, as well as the expected X, Y, and Z movement. For Invaders, this becomes your lethal weapon, and for Create, it becomes your extended interaction beam. In order for the Magic Leap One to understand the parameters of the player's environment, it uses a mesh scanning system. While wearing the Lightwear, we encourage the player to look and move around in their space, so that our tech can use this information to construct a virtual map along the way. This mesh construction phase allows for the establishing of place-based boundaries and identification of various objects within the area. We communicate to the player that the scan is in progress with ambient scan-styled VFX, which makes for quite a relaxing introduction to the tech. Being able to see the scanned mesh along the way validates that your reality is being properly represented by our tech, which means our experience will be able to integrate better with it. This visual feedback also provides an opportunity to refine the scan, should you choose to. For example, by viewing a lamp from every angle, you open up a new intricate area for virtual content to better align with. We disable both the VFX and virtual overlay of successfully scanned areas during gameplay, so that our game mixes more immersively with your interior design. We also use these captured environments to set up our scene in Unity. This established a baseline for us to be able to see what environment the scan picked up. In development, we could use this to iterate on our level design and methods of interaction with a realistic environment on PC. Both Invaders and Create build upon this environment mesh foundation to provide game experiences that are driven by narrative and by the player themselves. In this session, we'll each discuss how Character AI was implemented to reinforce either the overall storytelling or sandbox purpose. I will be discussing how we developed Dr. Broadbort's character, Gimbal, and how we extended traditional characteristics to accommodate companionable behaviors through what is still a very new medium. Andrew will then discuss the prominent NPC behavior visible in Create and how the independence and responsivity of their characters contributed to its sandbox feel. So let's get started. I'm a game programmer at Magic Leap/Weta Workshop based in Wellington, New Zealand. As a team, we've been working for the last 5 years on Dr. Broadbort's Invaders, one of Magic Leap's flagship gaming experiences. We were very happy to see its release 6 months ago after 2 years of dedicated development time. And to get all of us here on the same page, I'd like to share some of our game trailer with you. What you just saw was the potential for robot miscreants to invade your world through a porthole that acts as a projection into the 3D virtual world that is the robot planet. So our experience encourages people to immerse themselves in a science fiction world on a science fiction device, where they are applied with an energy-charged ray gun and told to blast through hordes of enemy robots, all from their own living room. As many have done before us, we wanted to incorporate a companion character so that our player would have a friend in all of this unfamiliarity. We felt that Gimbal was a good choice for our narrative, our onboarding, and the overall tone of our game. Gimbal was our attempt to do away with classic cinematic sections of the game. We have him project holograms of story characters in our reimagination of cutscenes. Not only do these holograms feel as if the story is happening around the player and bringing them into the fold, but having Gimbal as the projector makes him feel valuable and includes him in the story. From here, he can either watch silently as the story unfolds or report back to headquarters, but either way, it feels like he's in it too. As far as gameplay is concerned, there's a lot to get a handle on in a very short space of time. So we make the most of having Gimbal's constant presence. We have him guide the player through waves of combat or the new ways of interacting with contraptions. Having Gimbal there to provide context as to what just appeared or what new ability was just unlocked meant that he could adopt the role of mentor when necessary. It also meant we could avoid generating multiple single-use tutorial levels. Gimbal allowed us to provide lots of personality, not just for his own character depth, but also for the game and the game's world. He provides an excellent foil for the player character. Unfortunately, in mixed reality, there is only so much we can do to flavor the role of the player, unless they themselves want to cosplay, in which case, good on them. But through the strength of the companion's personality, we can help transport the player into our fiction a little more. For Invaders, we wanted to develop companion AI that not only served these common purposes, but also worked for the real world. To explain how we achieved this, we need to look at the underlying ways in which Gimbal exists in both the game world and the real world, as well as how he interacts with the player throughout. When we're first introduced to Gimbal, we're being introduced to the game as well. Gimbal comes blundering into your space through a porthole that seems to have attached itself to the wall. This sets the player's expectations very quickly, communicating that our content has a mind of its own. It also introduces them to a principle that the rest of our gameplay is focused on: content invading your space, for better or worse, through portholes on your walls, ceiling, or floor. And while the virtual content and gameplay exist in 360 degrees around the player, they can only see one slice at a time. People don't have 360-degree vision, and this slicing is even more noticeable given that human periphery is quite different to the bounds of our lenses. In fact, where our lenses are concerned, we don't have a peripheral vision, more of a strict cutoff. So we have to feign periphery where possible, or at least not call attention to its absence. This cutoff point was especially apparent where our gestures were concerned. In Invaders, gestures are used for shielding in combat, and players would understand that they had to gesture in a certain way to activate their shield. However, they would forget that they had to enact this gesture in front of the Lightware's outward-facing head-mounted cameras for it to be detected. To add to the feeling of invasion in combat, we leaned into the idea of our content having its own agenda, which fed into the fact that the game needs the player's input to progress, but they don't have control here. A key challenge with mixed reality is how to control whether or not the player experiences something that they're supposed to. Most mediums use some form of camera control to achieve this. Some mediums can hand over camera control to the player, and then it's their own fault if they miss something. Other mediums can wrestle camera control off the player during important story moments to ensure that the screen is focused towards the action. At that point, if the player is looking at their screen, they're probably witnessing the event. However, with mixed reality, it's a little harder to wrestle camera control when the player is the camera. So we have to lead a horse to water. We do this through various VFX and SFX cues, and also through Gimbal's behavior, but I'll touch on that later. Before we've even introduced Gimbal to the player, we have his spawn porthole programmed to wait until the player has seen this bizarre new fixture in their space before launching an overzealous, hyper-friendly robot at them. Having a component listening for player-based activities was our solution to a common problem of having awesome things happening, but not necessarily guaranteeing that the player is seeing it or knows it's even happening. To do this, we used head pose and field of view to approximate what the player was looking at. We used a headband frustum, which you can see in the scene view on the right, to ascertain whether a game object's geometry has entered the player's field of view. At times, we'll wait for it to come further into line of sight, which is that mid-range circle you'll see, before giving said object the go-ahead because it's been seen. This functionality meant that the player has a chance to notice their new wall feature before we trigger the porthole's opening sequence and have Gimbal put his best self forwards. Figuring out where to place the porthole in the first place is another example of working within environmental constraints. All content should be placed in positions that make sense, and Gimbal's spawn porthole is no exception. It needs to fit flush on an unobstructed surface so that Gimbal can emerge in all his glory without smacking into a shelf. We use this world search query system for the placement of a lot of our dynamic content. Here you can see it generating a number of viable positions based on various parameters we've assigned to the porthole specifically. You'll notice it's assessing the availability of space based on the porthole's open state to ensure there is enough space for Gimbal's dramatic entrance. The calculated positions, visualized here with their normal, are then assessed by various scorers that rank one condition as more important than another to determine the best viable position. For example, we might say that the clearance of space for content to exist is more important than it being within arm's reach of the player. For other content, we might rather the reverse, so that we can bring the content closer. In fact, let's have a look at what those kind of searches look like. Here you can see the viable positions for our floor-based content, demonstrating how the system favors and weights viable positions differently based on the content it's being told to position. Additionally, the color values help to show the system's perception of what is considered to be a perfect position in green or a terrible position in red, with various orangey hues to represent the positions that lie between. And you'll see that the positions also update as the player moves around the room, so that we're not likely to spawn something under their feet. To enable Gimbal's movement around the room, we generate a point graph once the mesh has been established, which tells Gimbal where he can navigate. We run sphere checks on each point to check the validity of the node before connecting it to the rest of the graph. We then run capsule checks between points to ensure that our little capsule-shaped Gimbal can navigate from one node to another. The nodes you see here marked as red moving around in the space is our flight graph's representation of where the player is. We actively encourage the player to move around, and we don't want Gimbal to fly through their body. It would just shatter the immersion. So every half meter of movement, we update the player's location to have their non-navigable occupancy reflected accordingly. And because of the player's dynamic movement, our mission selection system, shop, and other non-threatening interfaces are all dynamically placed. Here we see that the map has been spawned within arm's reach of the player, as the world search system would have dictated at the time. And it stays there once it is spawned, much like anything else in your house stays put once you've placed it there. But the next time it spawns, it will rerun the search in case the player is now on the other side of the room and this other spot is no longer optimal. And with all of these moving parts, we needed Gimbal to be aware of new content in the space and be able to navigate around it in a way that feels intelligent and natural. We achieved this by having the dynamic content register and deregister itself as it entered or exited the space. We'd then store its chosen position and the radius of space it consumed to carve out its volume from the flight graph, marking it as a non-navigable region. At times, the flight graph wasn't always sufficient, so we used RVO and raycasts as necessary to detect an upcoming intersection with any content in the space. If one of these indicated that collision is likely on his current path, the intersecting point is deflected to one side or another, which has him navigate around the object. Here we can see two ends of the spectrum, but at times the intersecting point wasn't quite so dramatic and made for some rather adorable, clumsy pathfinding, which was great for feeding into the character of Gimbal, but we couldn't risk compromising effective navigation for the occasional adorable blunder and didn't have the time to build in random low-risk collisions. And given that he's a flying robot, you might ask why he wouldn't go over or under objects. Well, with the restrictions of our FOV, we did worry that having Gimbal bob up and down constantly could be a little much on our player's neck, or it would make him seem a little erratic in his navigation. But by having him navigate horizontally, similar to how the player moves, we increase the connection between player and character simply because they each do as the other does. And in the same way that me clambering over the sofa to get to the kitchen for a snack quicker has a higher social cost, we made it so that Gimbal's path breakdown would weight vertical paths double the cost of horizontal paths. This meant that he could still reluctantly hop over or under something if his horizontal path was obstructed for some reason. Along the way, we make Gimbal's movement between flight graph nodes feel more intuitive and less like waypoints by using a B-spline on his movement. This softens his arrival at each flight node, making it feel more like he's moving through it rather than specifically to it. As a failsafe, if Gimbal is ever stuck, he has a respawn behavior. This allows him to try again from another position in the room. If he's visible to the player, he'll wait until the second they look away before deleting himself from the scene and respawning in another location through that spawn porthole we saw earlier. This was a quick solution to an issue that could result in the player thinking that Gimbal is shirking his duties when he's actually just physically unable to get from point A to point B. Having him wait to not be visible by the player was a step in the right direction, but I would have preferred if we'd had the time to make this more of a feature. Perhaps a bark that stated, "Have I tried turning myself off and on again?" We could have had him retract into the nearest surface to be spat out somewhere else, making this functionality feel more integrated with the environment. Or his eye could have flashed that blue screen of death we're all far too familiar with. But apparently scope is a thing. Having Gimbal navigate in a logical and intelligent fashion is but one part of making him feel as grounded as a flying character can be in this mixed reality experience. The way we get the player to feel any kind of connection to this floating hunk of metal is not only through slick art assets, endearing animations, and a subtle use of blinks and natural head movement. All of this has to combine with who he is to the player. And the way we really get to know someone is through our interactions with them. The player's first real interaction with Gimbal is very early on in the game. He's just rambled about something or other and is suddenly staring at them expectantly with a ray gun held out, much like a cat with a fresh-caught, half-alive present for its owner. Not only was this a great opportunity for the player to familiarize themselves with the more physical nature of interactions in this experience, but it also provided a bonding opportunity between player and companion. The extension of the player's arm to reach out and get their ray gun is a literal bridging of the gap between a real person and a virtual character. We didn't want Gimbal to be a detached attempt at personifying a hint system, or overly attached to the point that he's a hindrance. We wanted to balance camaraderie and companionship. This small incorporation of gifting the player their first ray gun was a literal step in the right direction at the start of the game. And we'll often see companion characters that need escorting safely through war-torn countryside, or those that fight alongside the player. However, Gimbal's a bit of a scaredy cat, so he'll tuck himself away in a hidey hole on the sidelines of battle, taking a more hands-off approach and letting the player take all of the glory. Gimbal's hiding behavior not only fed back into his character, but practically it meant we could reallocate resources that he was no longer absorbing to an extra robot or high-quality asset in the scene with the player. For example, with Gimbal's static placement, we were able to reduce the number of raycasts in the scene, or rather reassign them to be used by our enemy robot, the probe bot, so that she could accurately avoid obstacles instead. An enemy robot who flies themselves into a lampshade doesn't exactly feel threatening after all. In combat, we're also rendering an entire virtual environment for our enemies to navigate in and through to cross the threshold into the player's space. So during development, we were constantly reevaluating what was necessary and what could be cut or optimized. However, we still wanted it to feel like our companion was on the battlefield with our player. So we incorporated barks from Gimbal like "on your right" or "behind you," just like that, to help orientate the player during combat. This was especially valuable in those first few missions as we catered to players on two rather different ends of the spectrum. We have those who are used to the screen-based FPSs who stand rigid and haven't really moved far since their experience began. And then we have those ducking behind furniture who are excitedly overwhelmed by the fact that robots are invading their house. We like to offer the player a reprieve between sections of combat, and we do so with our home-based content. Home-base is, as it sounds, a safe space, still with cool things to interact with, but you can do so at your leisure. There's no threat hurrying you or inundation of stimuli alerting you at every turn, and it's made up of that dynamic content we talked about earlier. So how does the player know what to pay attention to next when there are so many intricate, interactable things in their space? And how do we foster player agency and free discovery while also ensuring they aren't just lost as to what to do next? Capturing or guiding attention is a common issue among all of the Rs: VR, AR, MR, HR. When faced with this problem, there were many ways that we as a dev team could and did go about doing this. With Gimbal, we pulled from natural interactions like the way children and pets vie for your attention. And we use our cone of visibility check again to see whether the player is looking at the most interesting thing in the room with them. We use this initial filter to see if Gimbal needs to collaborate with the player or guide their attention, and from there we branch the behavior. If the player is doing as we'd hope, Gimbal will maintain a collaborative position relative to the player and the object. And here he'll give hints if it's needed, but otherwise he'll just look between the player and whatever is being interacted with, seeming nice and, funnily enough, companionable. If, however, the player has found a nice spot of paint to watch dry on their wall, then Gimbal needs to hustle for their attention. But what does that actually mean? Well, the way we did it, Gimbal will stay at that collaborative position I mentioned just long enough to allow player independence to discover it. But otherwise, he'll fly on over to their line of sight. Here, he'll do a little gesture, cough politely, and indicate where the player is supposed to be looking before flying back to the object and hoping that the player's attention will follow close behind. Additional components such as his directional pointing and gaze behavior layered atop this functionality really gave us a lot of mileage in both the efficiency of communication and how natural it felt. As the player becomes more familiar with the content and how to interact with it, Gimbal can relax from his duties and become a more hands-off companion. As happens in real life, Gimbal's personality shines through more to convey a sense of comfort in the environment, much like the player should be feeling. Gimbal will hang out by interactable objects for longer because he's not having to guide your attention, and you'll see more of his fidgeting behavior or idle quirks. When the player is interacting with objects at a pace we expect, then his hints aren't triggered nearly as often, which means that idle chit-chat can come through instead. He may tell you about his latest daydream, or ramble about his crush, a beautiful stamp press named Brenda. One of the unique things about developing these behaviors for a mixed reality experience at human scale was that we could rapidly prototype through roleplay. By acting out situations and interactions, we could get an idea of how close we wanted our content to be to the player, and we could also see how close was too close for character positioning and conversation. We wanted to not only integrate with the player's space, but also respect their personal bubble. We could also gauge how natural delays in movement felt. How long should Gimbal wait before going to get your attention? Does it work for Gimbal to maintain the same position relative to the player, or should he move around in his own right in the space? Acting out these options and testing these behaviors in real life meant that we could get instant feedback and answers to some of these questions without much dev time lost to throwaway prototypes. I'm going to round this all up with some takeaways for you all in the hopes that you can learn from our development experiments, build on parts that resonated with you, or do things better so that you can further push the bounds of game experiences in mixed reality. From my perspective, you'll get a lot of mileage from respecting the player's space and having your character do so too. You can also use character navigation to reinforce the presence of virtual content and have them interact in the same way that the player should be interacting. Incorporate fail-safes. If something can go wrong, it needs to be accounted for. But can you do it in a way that adds layers to the character or to the game? Prototype in real life where you can. Do a first pass on proximity checks or delays and all of those kind of things. And pull from the natural world where possible. There are so many innate behaviors that can be modeled, so you don't actually need to teach the player. And come and see what it's like to be the player. We have a demo set up at the Unity booth. Feel free to come and check it out. We'll be running both Dr. Grordbort's Invaders and a new prototype multiplayer demo. I'll be around and about with some of the other developers if you want to stop by and ask any questions or just see what it's all about. But for now, I will hand you over to Andrew. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordan. After reviewing how Companion AI promotes interaction with the player, let's transition to other characters that may behave more independently. Here we will deep dive into Create, a virtual sandbox designed around your real world. And for a better introduction, I'll also start off with a trailer. All right. So what we just saw was a product of many pitches and prototypes revealing how high quality content can be integrated into your real world surroundings with spatial computing. Project Create was one of the main titles launched on Magic Leap 1 and was crafted out of Magic Leap Studios, the internal department devoted to first-party content. As a physics-based sandbox, Create introduces how to add and interact with digital content that is dynamically placed in your real world. This is composed of art, toys, characters that take up virtual space and build up on one another to make exciting scenes. The goal was to create an immersive experience that was easily accessible and again introduces the concept of spatial computing in an engaging way. By combining these playsets together, players will reveal exciting aspects of not only the platform, but the experience overall. Characters serve as one of the major pillars in Create for promoting interaction among other virtual content. But it's important to keep in mind the overall scope of Create. Characters are just a subset of a larger experience. So the solutions used for their overall decision-making AI had to accommodate other aspects of the project too, especially when physics and art-driven objects scaled up in the scene. So as a result, we honed in on two main aspects to drive character development: context and intelligence. As a mixed reality platform, Magic Leap 1 captures external data from the real world and converts it to a virtual play space that our game elements now live in. Given that both physical geometry and virtual content may change throughout the experience, we aim for characters that are constantly evaluating the state of the world they have now been placed in. Hence, characters need some built-in intelligence to make sense of this new context. By adding characters that act rationally, we leverage both tactical reasoning and decision-making to help them perceive their world more often and perform actions that are further influenced by their virtual surroundings. This led us to the following breakdown for convincing AI. Our characters should be autonomous, interactive, and responsive. But how do these all relate to one another? By giving characters self-driven behaviors, they are able to perform actions that simulate a sense of independence. Expanding their influence to account for the player and other agents in the scene can further promote interactivity and social awareness during gameplay. And finally, responding to the physical world can provide better affordances for our characters as they adapt to the new environment. So let's take a look at how we wanted to make our characters more autonomous and account for the current state of the world in their decision-making. Here are some core objectives we wanted to follow first when drafting AI for our characters. Given the reduced scope, character behaviors should not be overly complicated and be fairly transparent to the player of what actions are actually being executed. A system that is highly extensible can both make implementation more modular and extend pre-existing behaviors for added complexity if desired. Giving design a large role during development would more directly control desired outcomes and demand less from programming. And now that the players are in the driver's seat of this mixed reality experience, we should account for them to take part at any time. And finally, we wanted to promote interaction among other characters or agents that exist in the scene for enhanced gameplay. So with all these objectives, what's the underlying approach for creating these agents in our virtual sandbox? Initially design-focused, we wanted to build a foundation on traditional behavior trees. This gives us direct control on the series of tasks a character evaluates in their behavior. However, this revealed some constraints. This approach lacks dynamically adapting to changing situations and gathering knowledge from the real world. This happens so often in a sandbox setting. Therefore, we looked into extending into a more of a needs-based solution. One considerable approach was incorporating the beliefs, desires, and intentions model from Bratman's theory of practical reasoning. By breaking down agents into a needs-based AI, we can segment the planning and execution stages of our agents. Beliefs are external factors that are incorporated by agents during their planning and is a knowledge representation of the world. This may involve system and game-level states, such as a character being targeted for an attack, and typically involves parameterizing the world into simple variables, like is being targeted. One way of advertising ways agents can interact with the world is a concept highly regarded from The Sims known as smart objects. Smart objects define how an agent can interact with it and demonstrates how knowledge of a world representation can be linked to the object itself. These are referred to as actions, such as can be eaten, and can vary per smart object. These get fed into the desire or goals the agent wants to achieve with a desired end state, like satisfying hunger. These are meant to be temporary, as is expected that some needs take precedence over others, and whether they're being satisfied or neglected over time. These goals represent, again, something an agent wants to do, like being hungry, for example, in the case for the T-Rex. Taking action on goals represent the intent of the character. These are seen as tasks that the agent has chosen to do and can be executed sequentially if chaining tasks together get to completing the goal faster. When achieved, they then update the world state representation accordingly. So for example, if a T-Rex is hungry and finds a cheese smart object, the action of eat food will satisfy the T-Rex's goal of hunger. When selected, the agent then receives the sequence of tasks that fully completes the action and satisfies the goal. We should also note that this could extend to a utility-based approach as well, such that when attempting to satisfy a goal, there's an associated cost per action. So we choose the goal that costs the least to complete. With all this in mind, we wanted to iterate on this utility-based approach and evaluate how feasible it was to implement dynamic planning in our sandbox setting of Create. By associating cost to the execution of tasks, we continued to explore. Goal-oriented action planning is a way that an agent can plan based on available actions and the current world state. By taking in a queue of actions and preconditions provided by nearby smart objects, a decision tree can generate and from the desired state to our current one. This could also be evaluated from a top-down approach where planning is actually segmented into higher-level subtasks as seen in hierarchical task networks. These action sequences, again, reveal a chain of tasks that define which behavior the agent can execute, and it's the most cost-effective. At first, this seemed desirable for Create, as it would reveal new possibilities of actions each character can execute, especially when more content is dynamically revealed in the scene. However, going to these lengths led to some additional overhead that again exceeded our desired scope for Create. Performing the most optimal series of tasks were not as transparent to the player as we would have expected, and it made it more difficult for design to account for situations where characters were acting unpredictably, especially when smart objects varied in the scene. It was very expensive to recursively generate this plan when more smart objects and their associated action space scaled up in the scene. And once tasks began to execute, they were not as interruptible or configurable as they were with traditional behavior trees. So as a result, we chose more of a goal-driven approach. By simplifying our task selection strategy to be based on proximity and priority, designers had better insight on what smart objects were chosen and when. Also, task sequences could now be represented as branches in a subtree for better visibility, as I'll show later. And this again had the following advantages. With less resource usage from utility-based methods, we were able to simulate behaviors that appeared selective and design-driven. Goals could be stored in priority order, and these predefined task sequences can be dynamically inserted and ticked as a branch subtree, giving us more avenues for reusability and scalability. Also, these tasks now can be customized to be more character-specific within an action sequence, such as movement and animation. So let's run through an example of how our agents complete a goal and how these tasks are executed. Here we have our agent, a T-Rex, in proximity to a smart object, a cheese block. With all the nearby smart objects recognized on the next AI scan, the agent will run through all the available goals in priority order to see which action sequence is best to execute. We classify our goals as missions. By comparing all the available actions that could be performed on the smart object, the T-Rex confirms that an eat action can be evoked on the cheese block. Hence, the eat mission can be executed, and this is most likely associated with hunger being at the top of its priority list. Selecting the cheese block then uses the corresponding action on that smart object, which is a task sequence that's linked with the eat mission, and again, predefines how the T-Rex should eat the food. Common tasks such as move to and rotate can be generalized to locomotion and orientation scripts throughout all agents. However, eat action and celebrate are more low level and comprises of character-specific information like animation. These sequence of tasks serve as a branch subtree that will again be dynamically inserted and executed on our character's global behavior tree. Each task node will tick in sequence until completion. And here's an example of the eat mission in projects where the T-Rex approaches the cheese, eats it, and celebrates with a roar afterwards. These sequences can be extended and adapted to other smart objects as well. In this example, a ball is associated with the action of being chased. This is similar to the logic before. However, instead of eating the ball, the T-Rex will continually attempt to smack it. And this reveals how modular these task sequences can be when designing similar behaviors. So here's a representation of our main behavior tree. After scanning for smart objects, we select missions based on priority order. Once a mission is selected, the corresponding task sequence is a branch subtree that gets injected into the main behavior tree, and then it gets removed when finished. If a new higher priority mission is selected, we reset the action sequence by removing remaining tasks and instantiating the new subtree, which continues until completion. In fact, the nature in which a mission is completed can also influence how characters execute selected behaviors. For example, when a mission completes or succeeds, we can invoke a cooldown to prevent this mission from being executed again until a fixed amount of time has elapsed, like ignoring food once you've successfully eaten something, for example. This can prevent characters executing the same goals back to back and engage in other ones more regularly. Locking missions may be necessary when specific tasks in an action sequence require syncing with other game systems, and sudden interrupts may lead to undesirable results. For example, when a T-Rex chases and squishes a knight, the final blow is to animate the stomp and destroy the knight into a sticker. Because the T-Rex has initiated the stomp, the animation and the knight to sticker conversion should complete to its entirety, regardless if a higher priority goal has been recognized. Missions can also sometimes fail unexpectedly. By invoking stall handlers, we can gather further insight on how the mission failed and adjust character behavior accordingly. For example, if no progress has been made to reach a target due to constraints on character movement, we should bail out and ignore pursuing that same target until a later time. In this example, we show the limitations when a ball is moving just faster than the T-Rex can pivot, hence making no progress in actually reaching the ball. And if multiple attempts have failed on the same object, we can even ignore the target completely if desired. And now that we've described the self-driven behaviors for our characters, let's discuss how now we can expand that into user and multi-agent interactions. Characters themselves are smart objects too. When a T-Rex recognizes a neighboring T-Rex, we can take advantage of characters sharing the same goal priority list on their blackboards. For example, when one T-Rex greets, another neighboring T-Rex can pick up the greeting T-Rex on its next scan. This T-Rex will then respond to the greet accordingly within a certain time window. And when completed, the greeting T-Rex will register the other T-Rex has responded and successfully move on to other goals. When interacting with non-similar agents, we devised a ranking system that flags missions with interrupt priorities. When agents compare missions with their counterparts, they can check this interrupt priority to confirm if they should interact or not. For example, we have an astronaut that wants to scan the T-Rex. To do so, the astronaut checks to see if the T-Rex is in a low enough priority and by checking the T-Rex's current mission. If the T-Rex is in a high priority, such as squishing or chasing, the astronaut will ignore the T-Rex and not interrupt the T-Rex due to that requirement. But if the T-Rex is wandering, however, the astronaut can now force the T-Rex to react to scan with an interrupt decorator in front of our main behavior tree. And this will force the T-Rex to respond until that reaction is complete. And then once it is completed, the T-Rex will then resume back to normal behavior. Interrupts can also extend to other system and game-driven events too. Our AI scan can further detect user input and virtual smart objects that are added dynamically to signify game events, such as a character getting destroyed. This leads to other character interactions, such as fleeing from the user's controller or knights celebrating after a victory. So overall, we can get a sense of enhanced social awareness for our characters with these interactions. And one of the final segments is to further expand on these character interactions, and we could do that by following how they respond to the real world. Characters within Create are physics-driven, so their directed movements and responses to forces and collisions should coincide with the real-world geometry as closely as possible. So therefore, Create followed a scan and bake process. Here's a snapshot of our user's play space. Using our internal world reconstruction model, we can build a representation of real-world surfaces from sensors on the device. Your environment is expected to remain static most of the time, so baking these meshes into a physics system, we can provide a stable foundation for our characters to roam around in. Utilizing recast graphs and modified A-star pathfinding, we detect flat areas that are deemed walkable without much change in elevation. We can incorporate other factors, such as character size and proximity to outer edges, to modify what nodes are reachable when proposing these paths. These nav meshes, again, are baked into our play space to remain consistent and release additional CPU cycles that can be used for additional logic throughout gameplay. When 3D data is collected from the real world, they're represented as 1 meter cubic mesh blocks. These blocks are segmented to perform faster localized updates, especially when the play space changes. However, these regions can be extended with what we declare as skirts when aligning themselves close to one another for better continuity. But misalignments can still occur and introduce unexpected stalls when characters collide with them. To account for this, characters can impose a slight upward force against gravity to hop over any foreseeable changes in elevation. And this generates smoother paths that best fit to the contours of the terrain as you would expect a character walking on the ground. Obstacle avoidance can be enabled for other static geometry, such as walls that are recognized by our grounded character, and can extend to virtual obstacles as well. Using a collection of scheduled raycasts, we can determine whether an obstruction is near or to either side of a character. We then impose a force in the opposite direction of impact that both slows down the character and promotes course correction. Based on the current momentum that the character has, some collisions may not be completely avoidable, as seen with the green block here, but can adjust in real time when slowed down, as seen by the T-Rex avoiding the secondary orange block when continuing to pursue the knight. Some paths may show holes that have not been filled completely on device. Objects that have been displaced either too quickly from the room, dark lit environments, reflective surfaces, or just occlusions when scanning geometry, such as trying to see beyond a couch, could leave areas unrecognized, and we just need to make sure we account for them during runtime. But for areas that it is desired to navigate around stationary content, we can cut holes in the baked nav mesh directly to recalculate routes for our character in its A-star pathfinding. World geometry can impact how a character navigates and expose other navigable areas of the room. So let's walk through an example of a T-Rex jumping off a couch. First, we expose all the path nodes on the agent's current nav mesh. Then we find all the unshared edges, revealing the boundary of that nav mesh. And for each edge, we find areas that are unobstructed by other geometry using simple raycasts. This helps reveal what outer edges have a clear horizontal path if the agent were to jump horizontally. These vary based on different surface areas that are detected in the play space and can also be cached for future reference and quicker lookup later. Then we select a random node with an edge that's unobstructed and additionally check if any content is blocking the vertical path below. And then finally, we supply a subtle impulse on the character, resulting in a jump to the lower level of geometry. And this could also extend to jumping onto other planar graphs that are recognized in our play space. In this example, we have an astronaut, and we can query local graphs to find a node in a neighboring graph that we want the astronaut to jump to. We then interpolate waypoints along a path that will get the character to that destination. And at each waypoint, we supply a force to direct the character along the curve for a smoother trajectory. Expanding this to the navigation of our flying characters, we consider both the bounds of the play space our characters will be contained in, and also bias areas that the player expects to see related content, like having fish near the ground when coral is present, for example. When accounting for goal-directed behaviors and navigating around geometry for our flying characters, we divulge in a series of steering behaviors for desired results. As real-world geometry may appear non-uniform, we resort to subtle forces that could help realign characters on more favorable paths. For example, wall avoidance keeps characters a certain buffer distance from static geometry. With scheduled raycasts in each cardinal direction of an agent and at specified sight angles, we can impart subtle avoidance forces that help character hug around geometry until their destination is reached. This extends to virtual content that serve as obstacles to characters as well. We can detect obstacles with a sphere or box cast that accounts for the dimensions of the locomotion agent, scaling their look ahead based on speed and weighting distinct obstacles by proximity. We can achieve realistic maneuvers when characters approach a target or destination. We can choose to ignore other flying characters during avoidance too, as seen in flocking, and rely on our neighboring agents for separation, alignment, and direction. Seeking to a target dictates primary movement for our locomotion agents, and we could choose to adjust different speed modes if desired, such as sprinting to food to provoke stronger intent when reaching a target. As a result, we get a blending of steering behaviors that work in tandem. We balance forces that are imposed on an agent based on proximity to their obstacles and targets, which is seen here when luring a fish or turtle with food around a table. In fact, user manipulation is one of the driving factors when crafting a physics sandbox. Create allows the scene to be populated with a variety of playsets. And as these playsets range from inanimate objects to more sophisticated characters. And when a player is given full reign in this godlike simulation, the placement of items in this controlled setup dictates the interactions that will potentially unfold. So as a result, you, the player, can create unique combinations that are not as obvious as you'd expect, and can even resemble a whimsical element to the whole experience. Here are some examples taken from the community, and a lot of them reveal some overarching elements in storytelling. For example, a steed being mounted by a hero can be seen when snapping a knight to a turtle, or a cat and mouse scenario can be seen with a knight being chased by a T-Rex, but that's also being chased by a UFO. Emergent storytelling is one of the outcomes of creating believable characters in mixed reality. Your creativity can become reality as you combine these characters and playsets together. Imagine if this extends to a series of knights or T-Rexes going to battle, and other objects are further added and influenced in the scene, such as launchers and rockets. Altogether, this reveals a progressive narrative that you are unfolding. And when characters respond and act in a believable way, this engages the player and try and reveal more about the characters, and in turn keeps the player in constant discovery until they are fully immersed in the experience. So in summary, here are the key takeaways for drafting AI for characters in mixed reality. Simple behavior training can bring desired emergence in storytelling and bring added complexity as needed. Goal-oriented behavior trees can streamline the utility-based methods without the additional overhead as you would have otherwise. Exposing overrides to AI when needed can give you more direct hookups to your game systems. In mixed reality, expect the user to take part at any time. And finally, be sure to have additional checks for your characters to respond to messy or non-uniform environments. So that concludes our talk for Character AI for Magic Leap's Invaders and Create. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll open the floor to questions, and we have 5 minutes, so feel free to come up to one of the microphones to ask and pose your questions. We also have some flyers that are handed out for if you have any recruiting-related questions, I believe from Joseph. If he's not in here, he's outside. And we also have, please fill out the survey afterwards as well, just getting feedback for this talk. So again, thank you. Okay. Sure.
Thank you for sharing your special experience of spatial game development. And I'm an AI technical game designer of Square Enix, so I want to ask you from a point of view of game design.
Okay.
And I expected that the game designers should consider about the constraints of real environment and how to combat real environments to the game world to enhance such kind of spatial games. And did the game designer do well from the start, or did you engineer collaborate with the game designer for your developing experience?
Yeah, so to repeat the question, from the start in the game design, were we trying to incorporate the real world changes of the environment?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I want to ask you about that. The important point of this environment is the game designer understand the constraints of game real world, but it's a bit different from the game development before, the
Yes.
console games or such kind of games.
Yeah.
But how about your situation? Your game designer can imagine the point or not, or the engineer teach that point to game designer or something.
Yeah, okay, so to correct that interpretation, given that a game designer needs to, how do you incorporate the change of the real world environment as a game designer and have that be conveyed also for programmers as well to relay that information? Yeah, no, that's a good question. And basically, a lot of that comes through a lot of just rapid prototyping of saying, especially with when we were starting stages with Create, with the sandbox setting, that's why we went through the approach of a scan and bake process, where even though the environment, you're basically scanning a predefined version of kind of a dynamic environment. But in doing so, you have a benchmark of what happens when characters now move around this environment that maybe is trying to navigate around a table that you weren't really considering, especially when graphs are kind of dictated on different levels. And so I think it's just communicating with the designers and giving them basically a baseline to start off with first, and then iterate off of that with little changes over time based on the different dynamic environments that come in.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, I have a question for Jordan about the Dr. Godbots invaders. So you mentioned in your talk that you block off the nav mesh wherever the player is to prevent the NPC from hitting the player. But if the player wants to interact with the NPC, how would you handle such collisions? Like, does it say idle, and when does it move, and the player has to chase?
So with Gimbal, is it on? I don't know how to turn it on.
You can borrow mine.
Okay. Is this on? Okay, sorry, I have one now. So with Gimbal, we do have we call them hit reactions. So he'll respond to your weapons, which helps identify the variety in weapons that we've got as well. He'll respond in slightly different ways based on what he's being shot with. We also have a grapple gun that you can interact with Gimbal with. We tried to build in some of the behaviors so that it felt more like you were able to interact with Gimbal rather than those classic NPC examples where you try and just kind of mess with them and you just don't get anything back. Or is that just me that messes with NPCs? So yeah, we have some hit reactions, but also responses to just like bopping Gimbal on the head or those kind of things. I've seen people run around trying to hug Gimbal. Unfortunately, we didn't quite get that in. But yeah, we've done as much as we can to make him seem present and responsive, I suppose.
So when you reach him out, the distance is calculated, so it's not too close when you reach out to him, but...
Yeah, so he's sorry, I completely forgot to repeat the question. So when you are reaching out as the player, he does try and maintain your personal bubble, basically, which actually just protects us from having Gimbal's mesh clip through the clipping plane on the tech. But it also meant that he was in a reliable spot so that you could see him all the time. And we had to approximate roughly how long people's arms were. So there are a couple of just guesses that we tried to incorporate, but yeah.
Thank you.
Last question, but feel free to come and chat with us afterwards. We'll be sticking around, but we may move to the wrap-up area.
Hey, first of all, great talk. Thank you for coming out. This is really awesome. So you mentioned a lot about when you're baking the nav mesh into the scene, you sometimes get holes. And there was kind of an emergent way of creating gameplay spaces around that. Did you happen to find that during playtesting or during your iterative development of Project Create that you end up using these holes for more play spaces, or were you trying to eliminate how the nav mesh was baking these holes into the environment?
Yeah, I think because throughout the pipeline, there could be many things that could be not registering the hole, not filling the holes, whether it's sensory data coming in or being able to, and based on the information that we had, we realized, as you mentioned, as we iterated, as systems kind of were coming online through development, we kind of treated it as if it was just the static environment coming in. And that's why as we baked the nav meshes, we had characters naturally kind of navigate around them. But again, trying to incorporate gameplay around it such that we don't want characters to fall in holes. But of course, when in this physics-driven environment, when you pick up a character and throw them around, you want them to potentially go out of your play space entirely. So it was definitely in mind as we were doing development, but knowing that they were based on just limitations that potentially the device was having as systems, again, were coming online.
Great, thank you.
Yep.